Okay, let's talk a little bit about natural law ethics. And here, in our context, when I talk about natural law ethics, I'm going to be talking about St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law ethics. Probably the first thing I should mention here is that there is a long tradition of natural law ethics filled with a variety of thinkers that could be labeled broadly construed under natural law theory. And that tradition in moral philosophy goes back from the ancient Greeks all the way up to some modern figures like Locke and Hobbes. And so Locke and Hobbes are very different than Plato in many, many respects, and different than Aquinas. The Stoics, Aristotle, all of these thinkers, even though they disagree about much, could be labeled natural law under the broad definition of it, meaning that it's any approach to ethics that bases an objective moral, positive objective moral principles on nature or human nature. All right, and so that's a pretty broad definition. And again, in the broad sense, many different thinkers would go under that label. But for our purposes, when I talk about natural law on exams or something like that, or in lecture here, what I'm referring to is Aquinas' version of natural law ethics. And so that's a more narrow conception of natural law that we'll get into in this presentation. So again, as I just mentioned, we're going to be talking about natural law ethics and Aquinas. The quotations that I've got for you here from Aquinas come from the Summa Theologica. In many ways, it's an oversimplification, of course, but it's a big place to begin. We can think of Aquinas as Christianizing Aristotle. Right? And so we've already looked at Aristotle's ethics, talked about his teleological system, and Aquinas adopts that basic teleological system of nature and human nature, but adds God, right? So the final telos is union with God, but we can't really achieve that in the earthly life, according to Aquinas. And so obviously he's going to have some similarities and some differences with regard to Aristotle. One of the big differences is that, again, this is a theistic view in a way that Aristotle's was not. And we're going to have some different virtues to worry about as well. So here's what Aquinas says about the natural law. And so probably the first thing to worry about here is this idea that Aquinas is not saying that just because something occurs in nature that it is therefore moral, right? Or morally correct, right? That's not what he's up to. So he says here, to the natural law belong those things to which a man is inclined naturally, and among these it is proper to man to be inclined to act according to reason. So right off the bat, we understand that his idea of natural law here is not going to involve just because something occurs in nature, like our emotions or reason, or just because it happens, right? As a part of natural processes doesn't mean it's morally correct. It's going to be rooted in our apprehension of natural laws according to reason, reflective and critical reason. So hence, this is the first percept of the good is to be done and promoted, and evil is to be avoided. That's the first slogan, the basic slogan of natural law ethics, is that nature teaches us that bad is to be avoided and good is to be promoted. Right? So all other percepts of natural law are based on this, so that all the things which the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good belong to the percepts of natural law under the form of things to be done or avoided. Then he continues, the natural law is nothing other than the participation in the eternal law of the rational creature. And so what Aquinas is saying there is that the natural world operates and is ordered and structured in a particular way, think according to a telos, right, like in Aristotle, with regard to its function, right, including human nature. That's a very different way of thinking about human nature than we tend to think of it. But he's thinking of it teleologically, and in order to, so the basic idea is that we can observe by watching the functioning of society and of our and of the natural world. We can identify the telos that's proper to each organism, and then what sorts of things promote that end. And those are the things that are morally correct. So he says, what's man's ultimate end then? In Aristotle, it was just eudaimonia, but it was earthly eudaimonia. It wasn't any kind of union with God. So he says, since the object of the will is the good as an end, all human actions are performed for an end. It sounds very much like Aristotle there, From any point of view, it's impossible to proceed infinitely into a matter of ends. The philosopher Aristotle proves that we cannot proceed to infinity in the causes of motion because there would be no first mover. Aquinas gets his first mover argument basically from Aristotle. Again, puts a theistic spin on things with it. Without which the others cannot move, since they only move through a being who is moved by a first mover. In other words, arrows require a mover, right? A shooter, right? An archer. So man's ultimate end, he says, it is impossible for man's will to be directed at the same time at different things and different things as ultimate ends. So again, Aristotle talked of final ends, the one ultimate good around happiness, around which we organize all of our other intermediate ends in our lives to work towards that goal. So again, sounding very much like Aristotle. So again, he's going to have that teleological structure like Aristotle. He says, what is happiness then? That's our ultimate end. So again, like Aristotle. In the first sense, man's ultimate end is an uncreated good, namely God, who alone, by his infinite goodness, can perfectly satisfy man's will. But in the second sense, man's ultimate end is something created and existing in him, namely the attainment or enjoyment of the ultimate end. Now, the ultimate end is called happiness, right? So there's earthly happiness, which can be achieved, at least some measure of it can be achieved in our earthly existence. But then our ultimate end, that can only be fulfilled in the afterlife. So perfect happiness is not possible in this life the way that it would have been, at least in principle, possible for Aristotle. So he says, insofar as human happiness is something created and existing in him, we must say that it is an activity, for happiness is man's supreme perfection. Again, think of the perfecting or performance of excellence of man's natural function, according to Aristotle. Right? Same basic idea here. Aquinas continues, ultimate and perfect happiness consists in nothing else than a vision, or it should be the vision of the divine essence. In other words, a vision of God, the beatific vision. To make things clear, 2 points must be observed. Man is not perfectly happy as long as something remains for him to desire or seek. So as long as there's something unfulfilled, we can't be perfectly happy. And consequently, for perfect happiness, the intellect needs to reason the very essence of the first cause. So we have to reflect upon the very nature of God in order to achieve happiness. Therefore, it will attain its perfection only through union with God, the sole object in which happiness consists. Of course, he means ultimate happiness there. So what's required for happiness? Just as in Aristotle, we had this idea of a moral ideal that's the telos, the phronesis, right? The wise man that's achieved eudaimonia, and then necessarily we have to cultivate certain character traits in order to achieve that kind of happiness, right? Same basic idea here in Aquinas. He says happiness is twofold. The one is imperfect, which is had in this life. The other is perfect, which consists in a vision of God. It is evident that the body is necessary for the happiness of this life. Right? A certain participation in happiness can be had in this life, but perfect happiness and true happiness cannot be in this life, cannot be had in this life. So happiness has to be considered in two ways. First, the first way is according to the general notion of happiness. In this respect, every man necessarily desires happiness. Again, this is what we see by observing nature. Consequently, to desire happiness is nothing else than to desire that one's will be satisfied. And this everyone desires. So like Aristotle, again, we've got a list of virtues, right? But unlike Aristotle, Aquinas adds theological virtues on top of like the four cardinal virtues that we've already talked about. In the other thinkers like the Stoics and Plato's, and of course Aristotle had a longer list of virtues. So we get the moral virtues, those four cardinal virtues of courage, temperance, justice, and prudence or wisdom. The intellectual virtues, so again, very much like Aristotle here, understanding, wisdom, science, and practical judgment. But then what Aquinas is adding here are three theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Right? Aristotle might not have he wouldn't have recognized either of those. Charity of a certain kind, certainly generosity towards others would have been virtuous for Aristotle, but not the kind that Aquinas is thinking of here. Right? And of course, Aquinas famously talked about 7 deadly sins, right? So lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. These are all the worst aspects of our nature and not what's proper to our nature. What's most divine-like in us, what's most God-like are the virtues, right? And so again, the idea here is that we can look at a proper functioning of nature and human nature and determine what the telos is, and then organize what character traits we have to cultivate in order to help that, in order to promote that end, that happiness, to achieve that happiness. So we've got three basic elements in natural law theory. Again, Aquinas' version of this. Human beings have an essential rational nature established by God, who designed us to live and flourish in prescribed ways. That's a key component of natural law ethics in the broad sense. And so I write here that he's getting this from Aristotle and the Stoics, right, in that tradition. But even without God, even without special revelation or divine revelation, reason, our unaided ability to reason, unaided meaning it doesn't have divine help, right, or isn't illuminated by the divine essence. Just reflecting on our nature, we can identify and discover the natural moral laws, right? And then these natural laws are universal and unchangeable. And so Aquinas is usually viewed as a kind of absolutist in this regard. And so perhaps some people won't like the example, but there's already an example here in popular debates about various sexual activities. Some believe, Aquinas would have believed that sex, for example, the telos of our reproductive system is for reproduction, and so the only proper use of our sexual organs and our bodies in that regard is to promote reproduction, right? And any kind of sexual activity that disrupts or undermines that telos is therefore improper, right? Morally impermissible. Now, along with this idea of natural law theory comes this doctrine of the double effect. This comes from Aquinas. Difference between doing and allowing. So this is tied in here. And so he says, nothing hinders one act from having two effects, one of which is intended while the other is beside the intention. Accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. Notice talking about self-defense not being the aggressor here. So accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects, one of saving one's life, the other of slaying the aggressor. Right? So slaying the aggressor, if you have to engage in self-defense to the point of killing the other person in order to save your own life, that's the side effect here, right? It's foreseeable, but it's not the direct intention. The direct intention is to save one's own life. And so he continues, and yet, through proceeding from a good intention, an act may be required or may be rendered unlawful if it be out of proportion to the end, if you use too much violence to protect yourself. Wherefore, if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful, whereas if he repel force with moderation, his defense will be unlawful. So the only time, a lot of people hold this view, the only time that killing is really permissible is when it's in your own self-defense and that the death of the other person is required in order to save your own life. So there are four elements to this doctrine of the double effect here, right? So kind of flushing out a key idea of natural law ethics and Aquinas' approach to it. First is the nature of the act condition. So all four of these have to be met in order for an act to be considered morally permissible, according to Aquinas' view. So the action must be either morally good or indifferent. I would say morally neutral, right? Lying or not intentionally killing an innocent person is never permissible. Excuse me, that shouldn't be, whoops, my slide, that should be intentionally killing a person. That not shouldn't be there. And again, that's his, the absolutism that people tend to see in Aquinas' version of natural law ethics. Let me get this slide share back up going again, but I got a pinwheel for a second here. Looks like I've got some technical difficulties, so I'm probably going to edit this and jump back to it. Here we go. Okay, so four conditions here, right? Again, the nature of the act condition. Lying or intentionally killing an innocent person is never permissible. Intentionally killing, right? Remember, we have a distinction that I just mentioned between self-defense, right? So then we have the second condition, the means end condition. The bad effect must not be the means by which one achieves a good effect. So I can't kill someone in order to do something other that has a good effect, right? So Aquinas here is not a consequentialist, like we'll see later in the semester. Then we have to have the right intention. The intention must be the achieving of the good, only the good effect, with the bad effect being only an unintended side effect. If the bad effect is a means by obtaining some good effect, then it's immoral. Remember point 2 there. The bad effect may be foreseen, but it can't be the intention. And of course, there we have a worry. How do you really know what the other person's intentions are? How do we even, in some scenarios, even know what our intentions are? Although many of them are certainly transparent to us, we don't always know what we're up to ourselves. And then there's the proportionality condition. So remember, he talked about using more than a sufficient amount of violence to protect yourself. It would be wrong. Here's this proportionality requirement here. And this goes into his view of just war theory as well. So the good effect must be at least equivalent in importance to the bad effect. In order, it has to be at least as much good as much bad, if not more good, in order to make it morally permissible. So each one of those has to be met in order for it to be considered morally correct in this view. And then, of course, there are some problems with doctrine of the double effect. And your textbook talks about some general objections to natural law theory, some of which are similar to Aristotle, criticisms we encountered with Aristotle. But with regard to the doctrine of the double effect itself here, it looks like one problem is that the doctrine of the double effect implies some highly counterintuitive conclusions about what's moral and immoral. We'll see this with many moral theories, especially when we get to the modern ones, where it looks like the theory requires us to do something we have at least an initial reaction to thinking is immoral, right? So you got to worry about what to do there. Does that mean that my gut reaction about what is and isn't moral needs to be changed in order to align it with the theory? Does that mean we ought to reject the theory? You've got some stuff to worry about there. So with regard to 4.1 here, it looks like that, me converting to a different religion from the one that I was raised in the community of, which is going to upset that community, or maybe marrying who I want against the community's will, that those sorts of things would be immoral on this view. But many of us would want to say, well, look, you get to choose who you want to marry and what religion you want to practice. So again, the idea here is that it implies the mistaken conclusions about what is moral and immoral. We'll see later with utilitarianism and Kantianism, it looks like in some instances the theories imply things that we would want to reject. With number 2 here, it's unclear how closely the effect must be connected to the action. Does it have to be an immediate effect of the action? Can it be a delayed effect of the action? And so if you look up the trolley problem, there's where that issue comes in. The trolley problem is, pulling a lever and one dies in order to save 5 other lives. Turning the trolley in that scenario seems to violate conditions 1 and 2. There is a bit of a debate there with the doctrine of the double effect proponents, as I note here. Then there's the problem of redescribing our actions and our intentions, which usually are open to multiple interpretations, or often can be. So the doctrine of the double effect has already said that, intentionally killing a life is always wrong, and so it's thought to outlaw abortion, for example. So, but isn't it possible to redescribe that action in a way that would make it permissible according to the doctrine of the double effect? So, for example, some abortions are performed to save the life of the mother. Is that the direct intention, where the killing of the fetus or the termination of the baby's life, the infant's life, is a side effect? Well, that looks like we're getting, like we have a problem with regard to spelling out what is the actual intention there, and what is the actual action that's being performed, and how that influences what the side effect is versus what the actual intention is. And then there's difficulties with moral absolutes, and this is one that's mentioned in your textbook. which are tied to scientifically questionable conceptions of human nature. Again, we talked about this with regard to Aristotle in the textbook and in lecture, that modern science seems to reject this notion that there is a final telos for human nature. Really what it tells us is that, we're just perpetuating our genes in a population rather than giving us some kind of moral telos to pursue. So again, the same objection there that we saw against Aquinas. So there are some of the basic problems with this view. As a way of thinking about a slightly different issue with regard to natural law ethics, we might think of Snuffles here in the Rick and Morty episode Lawnmower Dog. And analogously, at least somewhat, maybe performance enhancement. So according to natural law theory, is it morally permissible to enhance Snuffles' intelligence, or is it is doing so contrary to nature? Is it contrary then to the, because the medicine that Rick gives Snuffles to make him super intelligent as a dog enhances his intelligence beyond what he could naturally achieve? Doesn't that show that there's something morally wrong about it, that we've used too much of something, or that we're somehow enhancing our natural capacities beyond their natural telos, right? If that was the case, then so performance enhancement, enhancing my body if I got like robot legs or something like that for non-therapeutic uses, but for like my glasses are therapeutic, right? They just bring it back to a natural level. What if I enhance them beyond a natural level, in other words? So it's the same issue there with Snuffles. And then, so I mentioned that question here at the end as well with regard to human performance enhancement. And so there's a little bit about natural law ethics.
That's all, folks.
As always, if you have questions, be sure and shoot me an email or post them in the forum or raise them during the discussion sections. Hope y'all are all doing well.